Today I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the most enjoyable books that I studied as part of my university degree. In my last video I said that I wanted to talk a little bit more about my university experience, tell you what I was studying, what I liked, what I didn't like, but I also really want to get back into booktubing and making book related videos again, which is something that I love, and I know that's probably what most of you subscribed for in the first place. I thought the best solution would be to combine university and books, bring the two together and make a video about them, so hopefully this is something that will interest you. If you've just randomly stumbled across my channel and you have no idea who I am, hello, I'm Jack. I recently graduated from Durham University with a first-class degree in modern languages and cultures. I specialised in French for the first 2 years and Spanish for the entire 4 years. My degree included a year abroad in the Canary Islands, where I was working as an English teacher in a secondary school, and honestly the Canary Islands was amazing, literally a paradise on earth, and if you haven't visited the Canary Islands you absolutely have to. So much better than the UK at the moment. I mean, it's raining outside, it's so grey, dark, miserable. You know, you don't really want to be in the UK, you want to be in the Canary Islands. Please take my advice, go on holiday there, it's perfect, you'll really have a great time. The languages degree at Durham was very interdisciplinary and very cross-curricular, so this means that you study a lot of different kinds of modules and you have a lot of different skills to master. I had around 2 contact hours per week per language for traditional language learning with a native speaker. So these were basically speaking classes and writing classes, like you would expect when you're learning any language. And then on top of that, I had around 6 hours of cultural studies modules. Cultural studies is basically just learning about the cultures behind the languages that you've chosen to study. So you get to look at literature, history, politics, artwork, cinema, sociology, literally anything related to cultures, just to help you understand the nuances of the language a little bit better. Before coming to university, I had really become interested in cultural and historical fiction, particularly by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. If you've followed my videos for a long time, you'll know that I absolutely love The Shadow of the Wind. That featured heavily in my personal statement when I was applying for university, and I just couldn't wait to get to university to study more literature in a kind of academic and more kind of intellectual context. I will say that in the first year it was a little bit hit and miss in terms of the books I was studying, so some of them I loved, some of them I hated, because in the first year they try and introduce you to basically every kind of literature that they can, and then in later years you specialise in stuff that you're interested in. So in my first year I was studying things from the 11th century right up until the 21st century. And personally, I'm not really a medievalist. I'm not the biggest fan of medieval texts, and I don't really understand why they were part of the degree anyway. It's modern languages, not modern and medieval languages. So I'm not actually sure how they were part of the curriculum. Obviously, maybe I'm just a bit angry and bitter that I had to study them, but they were just not my kind of thing. I understand their cultural importance, and they're definitely necessary for the foundations of the modern language as we know it. I just didn't really love studying epic poems and stuff like that. I'm much more interested in 20th and 21st century literature and culture, so all of the books that I am showing today are actually from the 20th century. The first book that I'd like to recommend that I enjoyed studying was La Peste by Albert Camus. He is a French-Algerian writer, and the translated version of this is called The Plague, if you're interested in checking out the English. This is a kind of existentialist novel about the depths of the human condition, quite philosophical at times, but really enjoyable to read as well. It basically takes place in this coastal city in Algeria. I think it was called Oran, O-R-A-N. And basically it starts and all these rats are dying on the streets, like thousands and thousands of rats. And it's a sign of something much worse that is about to strike the town, and that is a bubonic plague which kills many. The book explores how some people turn towards good and want to volunteer in the fight against the plague. They really want to help their neighbours, whereas other people become quite isolated and quite closed up. They kind of live inside like recluses. When we were looking at the book from a cultural studies perspective, we particularly focused on the central metaphor of the plague and then the victims of the plague. The lecturer said it could be read as a metaphor for the French resistance to the Nazi occupation in France, Basically, the rats would be the invading German people, and the victims would be the French people, and they're trying to kind of resist against this kind of oppressive movement. Obviously, you don't have to read it in that way, that's just one interpretation of it. Actually, I think it's just quite an enjoyable story in its own right, but if you're interested in kind of reading into things in a lot of depth, which you definitely have to do if you study literature at university, everything has to be analysed critically. You have to evaluate everything very, very critically and in depth. I think I've just said that about 100 times. But, you know, if you just want to read it for fun, I would definitely recommend it, even just to read for fun. I'm really repetitive today. Like, obviously, I'm not very good at getting back into BookTube. The next book I enjoyed was also written in French, but does have an English translation as well. It's called L'Enfant de Sable. I'm sorry if that's really bad French pronunciation. I haven't studied French for 2 years, so kind of forgotten how to pronounce it, and I wasn't even good at French pronunciation in the first place, so I mean, ignore my pronunciation today, but it's by Tahar Ben Jelloun. He is a Moroccan writer, and the English translation is called The Sand Child. This deals with the post-colonial condition of Morocco after independence from France in 1956, and in particular looks at gender identity issues. It's set in a very traditional, very patriarchal society, and the main character is called Mohammed Ahmed. And it's very confusing when you talk about this character because he was actually born as a female. So he's basically the 8th daughter to this father. And this father really wants a male child and has always been trying to have a male child because obviously there's a lot of rights and privileges given to male children in patriarchal society. So when he gets an 8th child who is another daughter, he decides to raise him as a male. The book's told from the perspective of a wandering storyteller who claims to have read Ahmed's journal and basically is kind of reporting on his confused gender identity. The reason why he's so confused about his identity is because he's been socialized as a male, even though biologically he or she is a female. And it's confusing because obviously in the patriarchal society, the male characters have a lot of rights and a lot of privileges that the female characters don't have. So when he's trying to resist this gender socialization that he's received, he's not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing, because essentially he would lose his rights if he embraced his female identity. It's quite hard to explain. I'm not really sure how to use the correct pronouns sometimes with these kind of characters. But I would say that it's a really, really interesting book. If you're interested in post-colonialism and gender studies, the two really come into play within this text. And I think it's quite a gripping read as well. You really get into it because there's a really strong sense of characterization and the context is quite clear as well. So even if you're not familiar with Moroccan history, you can still kind of pick up what's going on. So a really, really interesting and eye-opening read. So now we're on to some of the books that were written in Spanish, and the first one is La Casa de Bernarda Alba by Federico Garcia Lorca. This was published in 1936, around 2 months before the author died or was killed in the Spanish Civil War. The English title is The House of Bernarda Alba. Some of you might have heard of this, and it's actually a play. So I'm saying it's a book, but it's actually a play. I don't actually usually like reading plays, to be honest. I prefer watching them. I think they really come alive when they're performed by people on stage in a theatre. But actually this is quite a good one to read, and it's quite accessible. The language is really easy, even in the Spanish, so the English translation is also really accessible. It's set in a really small village in the region of Andalusia, which is in the south of the Iberian Peninsula. Bernarda Alba is the mother to a lot of children, and basically her second husband has recently died, and she wants to impose an 8-year mourning period on all of her daughters. So they're basically locked up inside this house. They're not allowed to escape. They're not allowed to have any relationships with men. As the story progresses, it becomes clear that tragedy ensues as a consequence of repression. Again, a lot of gender issues in this, a lot of issues about marginalised individuals in Spanish society as well, particularly in the context of the Spanish Civil War and then Franco's dictatorship, which followed. The fourth book that I really enjoyed studying was Los de Abajo by Mariano Azuela. This is actually about the Mexican Revolution, so moving away from Spain and into Latin America, looking at Mexico. The English translation is called The Underdogs. The main character is called Demetrio Macias, and he is this kind of peasant farmer in a very kind of rural, poor area of Mexico. And one day his dog gets killed by some government officials, and he leaves his family, he runs away into the mountains, and then finds these revolutionary fighters. It starts with the idea that they're fighting for social justice, for agrarian reform, trying to have more equality for Mexican society, particularly those that are the underdogs, the working class, really fighting for their rights. As the story progresses and the fight continues, they start to gradually forget about these values, and it just becomes about violence breeding violence and this endless cycle of violence that cannot be stopped. By the end of the book, the leader of the revolution is constantly changing. The characters are not sure what they're even fighting for or who they're even fighting with or against. They kind of forget what the purpose of the revolution is. So I think if you're really interested in politics and the consequences of political revolutions, demonstrations, protests, this is a really eye-opening read. Obviously it's from a Mexican perspective, but I think a lot of the sort of general ideas can be applied to the UK or to the USA. You know, obviously revolutions and politics and uprisings are a massive concern today actually, so I feel like this is quite an eye-opening read. It's from the 1920s, it was originally published as a series of newspaper episodes, so it was kind of put together as a whole collection when each newspaper had been published, if that makes sense. So it wasn't initially published as a novel, just like as episodes, and then it was put together. The next one that I want to recommend is actually a short story within the collection Los Relatos Tres Pasajes by Julio Cortázar, and the story that I'm particularly focusing on is El Perseguidor, or The Pursuer, which is its English translation. I think you can actually read the story for free online if you're interested, so I'll try and find a link and I'll put it down below in the description box. This story was published in 1959, it's featured in this particular collection, and it deals with a character called Johnny Carter, who is based on the real-life bebop saxophonist Charlie Parker. I nearly forgot his name. Charlie Parker, if you're interested in jazz music. It deals with a very dark side of jazz. It looks at a lot of corruption, it looks at a lot of drug taking and alcohol abuse. Very tragic actually. And it's written from the perspective of a biographer who's actually writing the biography of this Johnny Carter man. And basically he doesn't really like the idea of writing a biography with all the dark side, all the alcohol, all the drug abuse and stuff, so he tries to sanitize the life story of Johnny Carter by basically not even mentioning these kind of things that are so obvious when you actually learn about the character. It starts in a hotel room in Paris, which is completely trashed, freezing cold. This character who's almost lost his mind because he's been drinking so much and playing his jazz music. Julio Cortázar is really a writer who's interested in a divide between European rationality and Latin American authenticity. Obviously these terms are quite subjective, but in the context of this, particularly in the context of race relations and jazz music, it is seen that black jazz musicians are somehow more authentic than the white jazz critic who is writing the book. Obviously the white jazz critic wants to kind of sanitize this very dark side of reality, whereas the jazz musician actually kind of embraces it. Rather than sticking to rules and conforming to what society expects, he just lives the life that he wants to live, unlike the person writing the book who is very much concerned with social rules and social norms. We then have a book called Los Pasos Perdidos by Alejo Carpentier. The English translation is The Lost Steps. This one starts with a musical composer who's living in New York City, living a very miserable, very kind of inauthentic and dull life. And he gradually starts to go on a journey across South America, starting in Venezuela, then crossing the Andes Mountains and getting deeper and deeper into the jungle. He's on the search for something more authentic and something more primitive, and when he reaches this one particular village in the depths of the jungle, he finds indigenous people, he finds indigenous music, indigenous architecture, food, social norms. He understands that life is very different. It almost seems like he stepped back in time to the Stone Age. One of Carpentier's main concerns, particularly as someone who was educated in Europe, was the idea of European languages, literatures and cultures versus Latin American languages, literatures and cultures. And he really wanted to give a voice to those cultures who didn't really have a voice in literature at the time. He was kind of bringing these indigenous cultures back to life and really expressing them in a very poetic and a very lyrical way. I actually think the writing style of this is beautiful and really captivating. With the next book I actually have the English and the Spanish, so I'm going to show you both of the covers. It's called in Spanish La Tía Julia y el Escribidor by Mario Vargas Llosa, and in English it's called Aunt Julia and the Scriptwriter. So I'll stick with the English cover, seeing as I'm talking in English. This is a really bizarre read, so if you're wanting something a little bit strange, a little bit even disturbing, definitely go for this one. It deals with an 18-year-old student who falls in love with his 32-year-old aunt. So, I mean, that's not normal, is it? The character is actually called Mario and is based on the author's real-life experience, obviously slightly embellished a little bit for fictional purposes, but still, the fact that the author went through this sort of himself is really strange. The character works in a radio station in Lima, which is the capital city of Peru, and eventually he meets this woman who visits the radio station called Julia, and they go to the cinema a few times. Initially they're not really sure if they get along, and then they become romantically involved. Alongside this, we also have the story of a really eccentric Bolivian scriptwriter called Pedro Camacho, who works at another radio station producing soap operas. These are the weirdest soap operas you've probably ever read, and the story is kind of told in alternating chapters. So chapter 1 and all of the odd-numbered chapters deal with Mario and Julia and their love affair, and then the even-numbered chapters 2, 4, 6, 8 give examples of the soap operas that Pedro Camacho has been writing, but they're written in prose form, so you don't get them as scripts, you just get them as normal prose. But yeah, basically it alternates between two kinds of perspectives, and it is quite confusing. The idea by the end is that the autobiography chapters with Mario and Julia's love affair actually merge with the soap operas, and the two sides overlap. So initially it seems that we've got odd-numbered chapters and even-numbered chapters that alternate. By the end, they actually become so merged into one that you can't really even tell the difference. It becomes a question of literature and the boundaries between different forms of literature, different forms of popular culture. The soap operas that Pedro Camacho are writing actually change based on what he's going through in his real life. So rather than being completely fictional, they're based on his own fears, his own worries. There's one soap opera that we get to read that is dealing with this crazy man who dedicates his entire life to killing rats in his local neighbourhood. And that's not actually so bizarre, because we find out in the autobiography chapters that Pedro Camacho lives on the ground floor and he's scared about rats invading his apartment. Basically all his subconscious thoughts are reproduced in the soap operas that he writes. So I know it sounds a little bit confusing when I'm explaining it, but really fascinating once you kind of learn what's going on. It tells us a lot about literature, the power of words, the power of fiction, and then you don't know the difference between fiction and reality. It's quite confusing, as I've said about 100 times, but really, really interesting, and also a really accessible read, very funny. Actually, sometimes it did make me laugh out loud, and it was a page turner. So if you're looking for something a little bit different, I would definitely go for this. Just be aware, it's a bit bizarre. The final two books that I'm going to share are actually kind of grouped into the same category. They're by the same writer, Gabriel García Márquez, actually the subject of my dissertation. These were the ones I wrote about. So the first one is upside down at the moment. It's Cien Años de Soledad by Gabriel García Márquez, and the English is 100 Years of Solitude. I did actually talk about this book last year before I was writing my dissertation, when I was in the very early stages of it. I did make a video if you're interested, and I'll link that down below. I might actually make another video kind of updating you on what the dissertation was like, maybe giving advice for future dissertation students, and also telling you a little bit more about my argument. But this is literally probably the most famous Latin American book ever, really. I think out of all the books I mentioned today, this is the one that people have probably heard of the most. It's kind of like the Bible of Latin American history, and I don't want to say too much because part of the beauty of it is discovering things as they happen. It's a very crazy, very magical, realist world. But basically it takes place in the town of Macondo, which is in Colombia. It deals with the founding father, and basically the 7 different generations that follow him and all the highs and lows that they go on. There's a lot of violence in the form of civil wars and political revolutions, and in my dissertation I actually focused on the representation of the striking workers on a banana plantation. In Colombia, banana workers were really exploited, and Gabriel García Márquez is really critical of that and wanted to give them a voice within his work. So it deals with the way they were living and the horrible conditions that they were suffering. Looks at the way that they participated in a revolution against their treatment. And obviously I'm not going to say what happens and the outcome, but that was really a massive part of my dissertation, representation of banana plantations. And I actually spent I think 5 hours one day just reading about banana plantations in Colombia, like not in this book specifically. Like, I was in the university library just reading about bananas. You know, I mean, doing a languages degree, you end up doing all kinds of strange things. But this is a really great book. I mean, it's one that I think everyone should read at least once in their life. The final book I want to talk about is not necessarily one I would say is the most enjoyable book I've ever studied, but it is another Gabriel Garcia Márquez book which formed part of my dissertation. It's called The Autumn of the Patriarch, or El Otoño del Patriarca in Spanish. This one is about dictatorship, and it's very dark and very dense as well. It's not necessarily an accessible book, and I would actually say be very careful if you want to read this book, and certainly don't read this as your first ever Gabriel Garcia Márquez book, because it's just probably not the best choice. So 100 Years of Solitude is quite accessible. Once you've got used to the magical realist world, that one is okay. But this is difficult. This one is also written in a very strange way that's quite hard to follow. Basically, there are hardly any full stops. It's written in the form of a stream of consciousness, and the sentences just kind of flow from one to the other. And when there's dialogue, there are no speech marks. So you actually have to work out who is speaking and when they're speaking. And sometimes it's quite hard to know what is actually prose and what is actually dialogue. And it's confusing. I read it in Spanish, but I had to resort to the English a bit because it was just so complicated and I didn't always know what was going on. It sort of deals with dictatorship, and in particular the autumn of the patriarch, so the end of the dictator's life. So it's kind of final few days, quite tragic, and he is this kind of anti-hero, so a really intriguing character. I think if you're interested in kind of psychological elements of dictatorship, this would be a really good read. It's just not necessarily like a page turner. You do need to take a lot of breaks. So this one is probably only a book for the very brave. So those are all of the books that I'm recommending today. I hope this video is okay. I had to actually refilm parts of it a couple of times. It's so hot in the UK at the moment that basically my camera kept freezing and cutting out because it needed to cool down. So I'm not sure if it's a bit jumpy at different segments of the video because I've not filmed it all in one go, but hopefully it's not too bad. And I would love to know if you've heard of any of these books. Obviously, I know that not that many booktubers read books in Spanish or in French, but there are some really amazing translations of all of the books I've mentioned. So if you like the idea of the synopsis of the ones I've mentioned, I would definitely recommend looking into them. I'd really love to see more booktubers talking about these kind of cultural and historical reads, because I think they're really important. They have so much significance for different countries. Obviously, if you have read any of them, please let me know down below in the comments. I would absolutely love to hear from you. And I always respond to comments. Like, I've always been that kind of YouTuber who really values comments, and the interaction is one of the best things about YouTube. Like, my viewers make my channel, you know, without them I wouldn't be anything really. So I really am thankful for everyone who watches, and everyone who watched my last video as well. Thank you so much for the amazing comments. I was quite nervous about coming back to YouTube. I didn't really know what the reaction would be like, but it was generally really positive. I did look at the analytics, and around 14 people unsubscribed on the day that I uploaded my video, so obviously they were not really impressed by my return. But to everyone else who was really nice, thank you so much. I honestly do value all your support. I just can't wait to get back into making YouTube videos again and really becoming part of the community that I really love. So thank you again. I always say thank you about 50 times at the end of a video, but yes, thank you, and I'll see you all again in my next video.